Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar, Managing the Transition to DevOps with Value Stream Mapping. I'm Jesse Bronson, Marketing Manager at Constructs, and today I'd like to introduce you to my colleague, Earl Beattie. Earl is a Senior Fellow at Constructs, where he designs and leads seminars and provides consulting services on early project lifecycle practices, estimation, requirements, quality assurance, contract management, software methodologies, and more. We'll go ahead and begin the presentation, but feel free to ask your questions in the chat box during the entire time. My suggestion is not to wait, but to ask throughout the presentation rather than holding your questions till the end, since we are slightly ahead of you and there's a bit of a delay in Microsoft Teams. I'll be sending you an email once the recording of this webinar is available, which is usually within about 48 hours. Earl, let's jump right in and I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Well, thanks. I appreciate that. And my welcome, I'm Earl. And as you can guess, it's Tie Tuesday. Every Tuesday I put on a tie because I have to know at least what one day of the week is. I have very little now to change one day to the next. And so Tie Tuesday it is, and I'm a bow tie kind of guy. I'm really glad to be with you here talking about how to use value stream mapping to help us manage that transition to DevOps, because DevOps is extremely popular today, but it can be quite overwhelming, and we're going to get into that. I just want to reiterate today's tech a little bit with you that Jesse did. Please use the Q&A button. You'll find it up there that you can use. Click on that and then add whatever questions you want. But also that since we're in Microsoft live events, it allows us to do a couple really interesting things. You can actually pause the presentation and come back to it. Now the Q&A may be way ahead of you, but you can pause it, step away and come back. Or you can rewind and listen to something again. If you're on the web and somehow it seems to freeze on you, maybe you just hit the pause button. So be careful about that. So what are we going to talk about today? What am I going to give you? Well, this is what I'm thinking about. And so I've been working with DevOps now and value stream mapping for some time, and I've been thinking about how to really help how these can help each other out a little bit. So what I want to think about with you a little bit and muddle through is this idea of what is really the DevOps challenge that value stream mapping can bring to. So I just want to make sure that we're on the same page with that. And then make sure we're on the same page with value stream mapping, because it would be kind of useless if I talked about one thing and you had something else in your head. So let's make sure we're on the same page. And then we'll start looking at how to map the value stream. And I'm going to give you a simple way that you can use this tool right out of the gate, that you don't need to spend months and months preparing it, getting it perfect, but getting it good enough that you can use it almost immediately to help manage your transition to DevOps. So I'll show you how to use that value stream mapping to map the DevOps pretty simply, and then you can start seeing how I can start picking the prioritized steps. And then we'll sort of capture it all in the old Agile methods idea of inspect and adapt, and how we can still use the value stream mapping to help us get there. So with that, and then we'll wrap it up and open it up for Q&A. So that's what I want to be thinking about, and hopefully by the time you walk out of here today, that you have a good idea of how you can start using value stream mapping to manage your DevOps challenge, or even some other organizational challenge you're looking at. So let's talk about the DevOps challenge. What is this DevOps things about? For the three of you that are still out there that don't know what DevOps is all about yet, right? Because classically, what happened in large organizations, this wasn't as true in my smaller shops as much, but it certainly was true in the larger shops, that we had two different practices we worked on. One was the development team. The development team's primary purpose was to create working software in large chunks. And that was sort of different than the operation team's practice. The operation team said, let's manage this thing so the customer can always have a working place to go. And you can see that sometimes DevOps, interesting. So that was my doorbell, which set my dog off, and it's not even my dog. Sometimes send me a PM and we'll talk about dog stuff. So we were talking about separation concerns. And these two different concerns really drive different agendas, different policies, and it's causing some degree of mayhem, i.e. they actually seem to fight each other. Dev said we want to release stuff, operation would say, no, we have to wait off a little bit of this. Because they really were part of two different life streams, if you will. Operation was part of what's called the product development lifecycle. And product development lifecycle is this big overarching, how do we go from a general idea or something coming in to actually putting it out there in the real world and monitoring it, right? So we had this whole lifecycle, whereas software only worked on a bit of this stuff, right? Software was just that design and develop step in the middle of this product development lifecycle with its own set of practices and ways of doing things. And so we had this conflict between these two different areas. But one thing we began to realize relatively quickly, what we began to realize was that the faster we got software out, the more money we could make. What this graph is suggesting to you here on the screen is that even if we try to shorten up, what we have on the bottom blue line here is, what if we had an annual release cycle, right? If we just shipped on the annual release cycle. And this is how much payback we would get, what percentage payback. So after about, if we set a 3-year payback period, after 3 years, after the first 1 year release, 2 years later, we would have our money back, right? We would have made the money. But what if we could take that same sort of investment and release it on a semi-annual, twice-a-year basis? Well, actually, we would get about 25% more money than we do on an annual one. And that goes all the way up to a month release cycle of almost 50% more payback. That is, we would get more ROI just by releasing more frequently than the same software release on an annual schedule. So this whole drive is how do we get this faster release for ROI? Plus, I think you can see that we can even get faster release. We can get faster feedback. And with faster feedback, we could make better corrections and move forward more confidently. So we started saying, okay, we cannot have this thing operations. We want everything stable for a long time. And dev, we always want to deliver more stuff. So how do we start to bring these together? And this is the kind of thing you see on DevOps, is that these two circles kind of overlapping. And I think that was the strategy for a long time. Let's just get them so they align enough that we don't fight anymore, that we're constantly flowing things up. We get the faster release cycle, we get the faster feedback, the ROI goes up, the world's beautiful. And when we started doing this, we started, okay, maybe it's just an alignment of the practices and the goals of these two organizations. But what we started seeing in DevOps, this is where DevOps has really taken off in the last few years, has not just been, let's align these two philosophically, let's align these two with the overall goal and feedback, but actually, can we take those practices that we put down in software development and apply those practices to the development world, right? That is, we want to use software development practice, not this product development lifecycle thing that we had before, but actual software development practices of writing things, putting them in configuration management, and actually using software as the infrastructure of deploy and monitor and validation. So that is all code, and that's just another product that runs fairly automatically. If we can do that, we can radically increase the overall throughput. We can increase our releases if we so choose. We don't have to, but we could. But we also decrease the cost because we're taking more and more humans out of there that cause slowdown. So what we see in modern DevOps, I think, is not just a slight overlap, but a whole combination of practices where we start blurring, are there really any difference between these two? And almost back to the small shop world where development was operations, and that's just the way it was. So bringing these two back together by using software development practices overall. And this what leads us to our dilemma, because I got this image from a guy named Jim Bowman, and this is from 2017. So this is already 3+ years old. And just look at the number of software tools that have been created to do that product lifecycle, from the collaboration up front, the build, test, deploy, run, just dozens and dozens and dozens of tools. And I think that anyone starting any kind of DevOps operation is looking at this kind of landscape going, what the heck? Where do I even start? Which one do I think? What combination of these tools is the best combination? Which one is the best in class in each thing? If I chose the best in class in each one, would I string them together and come up with the best in class overall? Which one is cheaper? Which one has a better value for money? It's almost impossible to tell. The combinations are almost endless. And so the question is not what is the right answer out of all this, i.e., let's pick all the right tools and say, here's your DevOps in a box. The question really needs to become, how do I start attacking this kind of complexity, all these different moving parts, in such a way that I can build a best-of-class situation for me? And that's where I think value stream mapping can come in as a tool, because it can help us incrementally attack this kind of problem, because just trying to come up and noodle out the best possible solution usually means we get in deep trouble, as opposed to saying, let's use our same agile practices, those software development practices we've been talking about, and try to apply them to this particular problem that we see here on the screen, this idea of all this complexity. So let's use value stream mapping. And to do that, let's look at what value stream mapping actually is. Let's make sure our sense of what really is value stream mapping is on the same page with each other. So a value stream mapping, in theory, is pretty simple, right? You start from a customer request. Now, what does a customer request mean here? A customer request is usually someone outside of the thing that you're building that wants something from the thing that you're building. Some people like to talk about what is the job that they're hiring you to do, right? And whatever this request is, whatever they're hiring you to do, there's some sort of workflow that goes from where they currently are to where you give them this thing that will do this thing for them. So for example, if they want a hamburger, what is the workflow that you create and then able to deliver to them their hamburger, right? So they say, hey, I want a hamburger. Then we go back, we cook the patty, we make the bread, we apply the sauce, pickles, lettuce, all that stuff. And then we hand it all wrapped up to them. Boom, there's your hamburger. We have delivered it to you, right? That's a value stream. They want something and we've delivered something they consider valuable. Now they could consider that thing valuable a feature or a story or a value path of some kind, right? So whatever their request is, when we deliver that thing so that they can use it for the thing that they want to do, then we delivered value, right? It gets the job done for them. Now, if we make a crappy hamburger, of course, we haven't delivered any value. So it has to be something that meets their acceptance criteria and all that. And what you end up with, you start saying, okay, what does this workflow look like? It is simply a workflow. I like to use simple workflow notation for this kind of thing because doesn't need to be complex, because the value stream should be sort of the long tent of the pole. I'm not looking at every possible thing. I'm looking for how this thing typically goes. And so you sort of map out your workflow. This leads to this, leads to this, leads to this, and I'll go a little bit more into how you might structure that going forward. But when I say a value stream map, I'm basically talking about a workflow model as its base, something like what you see on the screen here. But there's something a little bit more to value stream, because what we want to do is we want to start thinking about what's going on in this value stream a little bit. And we actually create some measures for that. And there's a handful, about 4 typical measures. So we start with our input output, and this could be the customer request all the way to the value delivered, or this could be one step in the process. What starts that step and what's the output for that step? So you decide what's your input point and what's your output point, and then we look at a couple things on input output. One thing we look at is what is the overall time between the input and the output. By the time the first give the input till I've gotten the output, from customer request to delivery, or from the first part of my step to the last part of my step, what is the overall time? And we call that the lead time. The lead time is when I give you something, how long will it take me to get it back? So if I want it on March 3rd, how soon do I have to give it to you so I get it on March 3rd? What's my lead time, right? Very simple concept, but it's overall basically measuring the time it takes from input to output. Now, lead time will obviously vary in real life. And so you can decide a couple different things. I tend to use the, not the mean, but the median. The median is the most, or the mode. I like to use the mode, the most common number in a distribution, right? Most times it's like, so the mode is a good number to use. Some people like to use the median, the one that's right in the middle. Average can work. Some people like to use the longest time to make sure they don't do it. But I think the mode works pretty well for me. I like using that for a lead time. I like using mode for most of my value stream measures because it's the most common number overall. So I might measure it a few times and we'll come up with a lead time. So that's one thing. But inside that lead time, I may not be working on it all the time. I may work on it in bits and starts. That is, I might work on a little bit, then I have to go work on something else. I come back and do some more work on it, then go work on something else, or I get held up waiting for something. I got a delay, then I come back and work on some more. So I need to measure how much time in here I take all those times together that I actually worked on it, and how much time that I actually spend processing it. That is, turning it from the input into the output, whether that's the entire value stream from customer request to delivery, or that's just the amount of time in this one step that I spent working on this one steps piece. So processing time. Processing time is the actual amount of time on task. And it could obviously be no bigger than lead time, one hopes, but it's at least some amount, hopefully it's a reasonably good amount of that overall lead time is the processing time. How much time on task? Now that I have those two things, I can sort of compare them to each other and come up with what's called the activity ratio. The activity ratio just says, hey, let's divide the processing time by the lead time. Now, if the processing time and lead time are exactly the same, you'll get 1, which is pretty darn good, right? That's 100%. You're using everything that you've been given on processing time. That's a pretty efficient in terms of time. Now, if we can shrink the processing time and the lead time at the same time, that's even better, but at least you're doing as best as you can given the current technology you're using. If that number is less than 1, that is the processing time is smaller than the lead time, you're going to get a fraction. So we move the decimal point over 2, and we'll call that a percentage. So if you're only doing half the time of the lead time and processing, you'll get an activity ratio of 50%. The smaller the percentage, the worse you are. Okay, that means there's an opportunity there of some kind. The other thing we're going to do is we're going to say, hey, yeah, we're doing all this processing, but are actually making the right thing? That's a different question, right? We could be actually very good at using up all our activity ratio could be 100%, but if it's also 100% wrong, right, that's not very useful. So there's actually a question about saying how much of our stuff is complete and accurate. And you see this percentage C and A, complete and accurate. And this is usually the step next in line is sort of saying, I'm assigning you how often I can use the stuff you produce on a regular basis. And again, the higher the number here, closer to 100%, the better off you are. The lower the number, the worse you are. So both these numbers, 100% means, hey, you're doing as good as you can given the technology, and everything you're making is perfectly useful the way it is, to 1%, which means you're hardly working and then you have to give you tons of lead time, and that stuff you make is garbage. So those are the 4 metrics we're going to apply, and then we apply them to the steps of our overall workflow. Once we see our workflow here, we can see that each step talks about its lead time, how long it takes to get through that step, the processing time, how much time I actually spend working on that step, and how well that step actually produces things I can use in the next step. So if you look at step 1 up here, design and analysis, see if I can get my little pointer up here, design analysis, we can see the lead time is 2 weeks. 2 weeks it takes you, by the time someone gives you something to work on design analysis, it takes 2 weeks before you're typically done with it. And again, not everyone's going to be exactly 2 weeks, but I was using the mode, the most common number over this. PT, processing time, 2 days. That tells you something right off the bat of this particular process, that while the lead time's 2 weeks, I'm only spending about 2 actual effort days getting it done. That means there's 8 days that is sitting around waiting for me to work on it. And when I do work on it, I'm only getting about 3/4 of the work done correctly. That is, it's useful by this next step over here. It can use that bit over here that it produced in the correct way. So that's what this is telling us. And we go through, we do this for each of our steps. You notice down here on the backlog one, I'll just circle it because it's a little bit easier, that this one doesn't have a PT or a percent CNA because it's just a cue point, someplace where something's waiting. And I just draw that as a diamond because I'm, again, using simple workflow template stuff, okay? So that's what we're looking for when we're talking about a value stream map. We're trying to get to this particular point right here where we have this kind of map that we can use to help us decide what to work on next. So to map the value stream, how are we going to do that? Well, let's start out and think about what we wanted. We wanted to come up with an overall map that's a simple workflow that allows us to then put some measures on it, then allows us then to make some decisions going forward. So how do we start with that simple map? Well, the way I like to build my workflows is always start from the back end. I start down here at delivery. Where do I want to end up? And then I ask, what is the most common thing that's just before it? What's the most common activity that I tend to do that's just before the thing I'm doing right now? Not the everything, but the most common thing. Because what I'm trying to do is get a sense of the overall flow here. So I just say, what's the most common thing before that? And then I go before that one, and I say, what's the most common thing before that? The most common thing before that, before I get back, and I'm usually taking it back to my product backlog item, right? My value streams here are typically going from a release point or a staging point. If you don't release every time, a staging point. But I'm typically going from one point where I'm saying it's done and ready to be given to the customer whenever we choose to do that, to back to the point where it's a product backlog item on my backlog. That's usually the stream I'm mapping for DevOps. Now, you might take it back a bit further. You might have some design steps you want to include in that before it gets to be a PBI. Maybe some refinement steps might make sense for you as well. But typically what we see is going back to the PBI point. So I start from the back end. I start back here at delivery again, right? And then I move that direction because that way it makes sense. A lot easier. Not that it makes sense. It's just a lot easier to do than trying to start at the front and go forward, because the forward always has so many options about what could happen next. But going backwards, the most common thing is usually a lot clearer and easier to see. So start at the back and move toward the front of your overall thing. Then once I've got that laid out, all of those direct things, I try to keep it really simple at this point. And by keeping it simple, I mean, I'm not trying to put in every kind of alternate path and every kind of way that's going out here, because I'm not trying to model the entire workflow for the sake of knowing the workflow. I'm trying to model it just enough so I can start saying, where's the main opportunities for value? And if these are all the most common things, these are things I'm doing almost every time, that's the place I want to look first. I want to look at the place that we deal with on a daily basis. So I want to keep it very, very simple at this point. And so I'll just say, hey, got the backward things. I'll map out, make sure the sequence still makes sense, and I'll have my steps from wherever I started, which typically is the PBI, to my delivery point. So once I got that, right, whatever that process is, then I'll start doing my measures. And I'm doing my measures, and I still have my two measures I have to create. I have to measure my lead time and my processing time. Now, this may seem daunting at first. It's like, oh, I have to go walk around with stopwatches and measuring things. But remember, we're not trying to do this to be perfectly precise and have the ultimate truth. We're trying to get at the right story. And this is where I separate the idea of being accurate from being precise. That is, we want to have the right story. We want to be accurate. We want to have the right gist of where to start putting our attention first. We don't necessarily need to have a precise thing of exactly what happens every time we do this thing. So I'm looking at lead time and processing time, and I'm trying to collect that data. I'm going to try to keep it very, very simple. That is, I'm going to sample all the timings. I'm going to look at 3, 4, 5 of these things, and just to get a sense where are things going on, and maybe I want to do some additional measures overall. And I'm going to do something what I call close enough. That is, I'm going to be asking people about how long did that take? I'm not going to stand there with a stopwatch trying to time this thing. I'm going to be asking people about how long did this take? When did it show up? About when did it go away? And the about whens, or roughlies, the arounds are still going to be close enough to allow me to make decisions about where I want to put my first steps in a DevOps transformation kind of thing. Because it's going to tell me where the big pot of gold is. If I'm down to something being 3 days versus 4 days, that's within my margin of error. I would just call them roughly the same. But if I'm looking for something that says 20 days versus 2 days, now I know when to go look, right? Obviously, the 20 days one is like, there might be more opportunity there than the 2-day one over here. That's the kind of thing I need from this kind of value stream mapping for DevOps. I'm not trying to compensate people. I'm not trying to prove anything. I'm trying to make a decision about where to put my attention in my transformation. When I'm doing this, though, one thing that I always want to pay attention to is watching the spaces between the processing time, which, using the phrase from I remember when I first visited London years ago, mind the gap, right? Because it's these gaps that often are the most interesting places that you can find things that you can possibly improve. And the two things that tend to stand out really in those gaps, one are a thing we used to call the manufacturing floor hidden factories. When I used to work in manufacturing, which led me to the Tuesday bow tie day, particularly because I used to have to wear a tie out on the manufacturing floor, is that I liked bow ties because they didn't get caught in the machinery. A lot safer, right? But one of the things we saw is that we mapped out the processes, and we would start seeing, as we walk through it, things disappear for a while and then come back. And then we're what we called hidden factories. There were places where work was happening that no one really acknowledged or wanted to be clear about because we had to do that to get it done. Extra meetings that people were holding, or special little dies they had created to make sure things happen correctly. So these hidden factories were ripe opportunities to either improve our processes or speed things up. So you want to watch out. Is work going someplace else, or other people having to get involved in things that we don't really acknowledge that we need to clean up in order to help transition and make things go faster? The other place, of course, is multitasking. Multitasking, of course, is the bane of all development cycles, trying to split our attention 5 to 6 to 12 different things. I'm currently working with a team right now, but everyone has to multitask 6 different ways, and it's slow. Everything's really, really slow. And if we're looking at DevOps to speed up our overall releases and get that better ROI and faster feedback, multitasking is something that we can really look at, and we'll see it often in the gaps. We're delaying for something, or we have to go work on something else because priority has shifted. The gaps will show us those kinds of bits. And then once I got those gaps, I've identified my processing time, I've got my lead time, then I want to look for my CNA loops. And this is something that, again, may not be very clearly articulated. It's kind of like oftentimes a hidden factory of its own. That is, someone's doing work in one step and says, oh, this isn't quite right. And either they do that previous step work themselves. This is extremely common, right? Where they've got something that's not done and they do the previous steps of work just to get it done. Then they have to do their work too. So that's the CNA loop. It's not called out as a CNA loop in any kind of process flow or even in your flow, but it's happening all the same. And there's also the more formal one where we have to get the people that did the work before to come back and correct that work. So what I'm looking for, I'm first looking for the loops. I'm just trying to identify the loops. Is there a loop here at all? And we can then ask the question about how much of this loop do you have to execute? Do you have to execute on half the stuff that comes in, a quarter of the stuff, 1/10 of the stuff? And I like to use just sort of round numbers here. I'm not looking again for this, is it 12.37% of the stuff coming in? I don't care about that. I need just close enough so I know where the right direction is going. And so using this kind of scale where I'm using, we don't have to do anything, to where we almost have to do everything, and then 10, 25, 50, 75 seems like a reasonable scale to me, right? That is, it's about a quarter, it's about half, it's about 3/4. It's pretty close. It's close enough for me to make good decisions going forward. Again, no one's paycheck is riding on this, but our decision-making ability is benefited from this, and it's close enough for you to move on without having to get into nuts and bolts and little tiny details that may not be as useful. So finally, we get our value map, right? We're back to where we were before. We got the lead time by asking about, well, just watching where it comes in, what's going out, sampling a handful of those. We got our process time by looking at the questions, and then we start paying attention to the gaps, because the gaps are going to help us show hidden factories that may help us even change our value stream map, because we actually have to include something that happens every time, right? Or we start seeing where multitasking is happening, and just we want to note that down because there's a ripe source for potentially improving this overall value stream. And then we start looking for CNA loops. And once we start seeing CNA loops, we start to ask the question about, well, how often do we have to invoke that loop? Is it every time? Is it most of the time? Is it just some of the time? Right? And then we gave those numbers going forward. So that gives us our value stream map. Now that we have our map, let's see how we can start using that to transfer us into doing something better about DevOps. And I think it's primary phase to start saying, where do we want to start? Because we saw that transformation was a big pool of possibilities. And where do we want to start? And I want to start suggesting you start looking at a couple things here. One is you take a look at your value stream map. And the first place you might want to look is, where do we have low AR? That is, that we got a lot of lead time and very little processing time. This is the point where we have a lot of those hidden factories or those multitasking things going on. These are ripe for improvement. They're usually often even sense low-hanging fruit. If we could just rearrange some people's structures, change some priorities, we often get a lot of these things flowing a lot quicker. And if we have a lot of delay because of manual processes, automating some of those can actually make it go faster. So we take overall AR and can reduce it by taking some of the manual stuff out and automating that. We don't have multitasking, often in automation, in the sense of that one task has to stop and go work on something else. It just finishes that task and then go works and switches to the next thing, but it actually finishes it first. So low AR is a really good place to look. Then we can look at our loops. I look at AR first, but then I look at my loops. Where do I have my CNR loops? Now, I don't look at my CNR loops first often because you're saying, well, that's broken. It doesn't really help a lot of people. It's easier to lower hanging fruit to get out the multitasking and some of the hidden factories. Then it's to start saying, we've got to change that for the better. But once I got my low hanging fruit done, the CNR stuff is the stuff I tend to look at next. Because that says, okay, we're going to take, say, we got development and dev testing. Looks like it's at 90% okay, but it's our show and UAT, showcase and UAT is down to 50%. So what's going on there? Here's where we might think about reinventing it. Whereas the low A&R, we're just sort of automating what's really there. When we see a low C&R, we want to think about rebuilding it almost from the ground up. How do we want to restructure this? And this is often a little bit more undertaking. So again, low A&R first, then low C&R is my next bet. Once I choose one of these things, okay, which one has the better potentiality, which likely it's easier to do, because I like to do small things first, get fast wins off the bat, because if I do that, it gives me some momentum and gives me insight how to make the next best decision, right? Because I'm going to do this inspect and adapt thing going forward. But once I choose this thing, I don't just choose it by itself. Yeah, I'm going to start looking at that thing by itself and start that selected thing I'm going to do. And I'm going to have conversations with the dev person there, the op person there, whoever's really involved in that, and maybe some additional subject matter experts who are involved in that as well, right, to understand it. But I can't just stop with talking to them. Because if I talk just to them, what I often end up is what I call process shifting. They say, oh, here's how we make our things better. All of a sudden, someone upstream has more work or someone downstream has more work, and their thing is just beautiful all by itself. What I really want to see is how do I make the whole thing better? So instead of just talking just to them, I'm also going to talk to the people that feed them. What are you giving them? How do we make sure that's the right thing and make sure the balance between what they're being given into the step and what they're doing in the step is the right balance? That they're not doing the previous step's work, but the previous step doesn't have to do all of their work as well. Let's make sure we maintain that balance really well and that we have good C&A right from the previous step. That could be a lot of ways to improve it already. I also want to talk about the downstream consumers, the people that are doing the next thing on it. Because again, if they're doing their stuff here and they're not delivering good stuff to the next step, who cares what we did? We still have a lot of C&A loops. We're going to slow down our value stream. So what we want to do is talk to the next step, see what's the right balance here. What do you really need to get your job done without shifting all of that work back up to us, right? You still have to do your job, but how can we make it so that you have the right stuff to do your job, to make sure all that's together. So don't just look at the one step, but look forward and back on that step to make sure everything's in balance so that the whole thing's flowing well, not just being dumped into one spot. Because you really want to avoid that thing, which I like to call process shifting. And then once we do that, we start saying, okay, now that we see this balance, what the balance should be, let's start building what are the steps to make that happen. So you start collecting a lot of little steps. And again, here's where you might want to follow some of the same practices we do when we're building on any kind of plan in Agile, is that we want to keep these steps relatively small. We might describe them big, but then we want to break them down even to smaller steps, something we consume in a short period of time. Because just like I have my backlog of things I want to do on the Agile side, I have my backlog of things I want to do on the DevOps as well. In fact, I like keeping a separate backlog for DevOps. Now, why is that? Because a lot of Agile gurus will tell you, no, you should have one backlog for all the team's work. And I do something different. I have different backlogs for different kinds of work for the team. And I have a different one because of a couple reasons. One, I want velocity to reflect just the product backlog so the product owner can make reasonable predictions about the future without worrying about any other kind of work going on like DevOps work. And two, I don't want to try to point DevOps work. I don't want to even try to apply points to it. I don't think there's any value in that for the most part. So I want to say, okay, I'm going to do some work on DevOps, and I just want to time box that work. I don't want to size it. I just want to time box. I'm going to say every sprint or every other sprint, we're going to dedicate 10% or 5% or 15% or some allocation of what we want to do to DevOps. That's just taken off the board. And then velocity will actually reflect what I'm doing on this product backlog thing, because my velocity is saying if I'm dedicating 15%, my velocity will shrink, but it'll be an accurate representation of how we're moving through the product backlog, right? And then once I got my own DevOps backlog, then the team could decide what's the next best DevOps step. They could start owning this DevOps transformation. It's not being driven by a product owner or somebody technically outside. The team can start ordering it because now it's a separate backlog that they can control. So I like having separate backlog, and I want those next steps to be something that they can consume in a reasonable period of time. Now, I don't necessarily need to have them all consumed in a single sprint. That's the another beauty of the DevOps backlog is that carrying a thing from one sprint to the next, given my time box, it's okay with me. I'm not trying to measure velocity from it. I'm not trying to deliver value directly from this thing. I'm trying to increase the throughput and the flow so that we can deliver faster of the things that truly are valuable. So I want a separate backlog overall. Then once I've done that, then I just invoke the inspect and adapt process. And everyone has their own inspect and adapt process. I have my own inspect and adapt process overall. It looks something like this, right? I call it AXOR. I actually originally called it AOR, A-E-O-R, because you look at the first letter of assess, experiment, observe, and resolve, AOR. And I said, here's my version of plan, do, check, act, or any kind of inspect and adapt cycle. And I said, here's mine. I call it AOR. And a person in one of my classes said, Earl, that sounds like a donkey from Winnie the Pooh. I went, oh, right. And they said, well, if you call it AXOR for experiment, AXOR, that sounds much cooler. I went, oh yeah, that does sound much cooler. I like that. That is much cooler, right? And so now it's AXOR. But this idea of AXOR basically says you go through any one of these plan, do, check out, you have to assess where you're currently at. And that's what we're doing with the value stream mapping. That's what it's really set to do for you. It's saying, okay, here's what we're really doing. And the value stream map is your assess point. And then you come up with experiment. You say, okay, look at this poor ANR, right? We've got a low ANR here percentage. Let's try something here. Let's experiment. So you try to experiment. You try automating. You try bringing in a tool. And the first time you experiment, and I should sort of map this out here. I think this is kind of important here. The first time you experiment with something, if you take your overall ability to do something, a 1.0 ability to do something, the first time you try it, right, you're actually going to get lower productivity because you have to figure all the kinks and bugs on it. And you have to do that a few times before you finally wrap yourself back up till you get to some better productivity, if it's a helpful tool at all. Now, one of the things I found is that how long is this dip for? Well, I find it's typically between 3 to 5 cycles, whatever you're trying to do, right? 3 to 5 cycles. So if we're looking back here on my AOR thing, right, my analyze, experiment, observe, and refine thing here, my experiment needs to last 3 to 5 cycles. And I can observe what's happening in the cycles. And I don't want to take the first observations as the end all be all, because I'm probably in that little trough of despair there before I come back out and start seeing what it's really doing. So after about 5 cycles, I take a good look at it and we decide one of two things. Yes, this is great. Let's keep doing it and enhance it maybe. And let's go look at the next place on our value stream map where we can probably attack something. Or we say, no, that's not quite what we want. This is still the most valuable place to attack, but this solution isn't working. What do we want to try next? And we adjust the experiment or switch out the experiment and run another 3 to 5 cycles. So this inspect the depth then allows us to go through and then get that one going pretty well and then start saying, where do we want to attack next? And maybe we need to update our map again because now that experiment may have switched our flow and because our next step might have been like, hey, we could actually go faster now because we're getting better Q and the CNA out of you, the correct and accurate out of you. So we're able to execute even better. Awesome. We love it, right? So that's the kind of thing we're looking at. We start this inspect and adapt cycle and just then walk our way through it. So sort of wrapping it up here, right? The challenge is that there's so much we could possibly do. There's so many things going on here that it's hard to know where to start. So what we want to do is we want to bring our value stream mapping to this. And we want to keep it pretty simple. We're not looking for, prove that you should have a job value stream mapping. We're not looking for, make sure we're justifying every penny of our money value stream mapping. We're looking at some basic value stream mapping here. We're looking at as simple as we get it because when we can then map the value stream in this basic thing, and that'll give us good enough information to saying, where should we look for? And we want to pick those areas that have the lowest hanging fruit. And we always want to start saying, where is the best possible investment of our time? And that's going to be in the low ANR areas, right, where we actually have our activity ratio is really, really bad, or our correct and accurate is really, really bad. Those are the big areas. But the first one is my ANR, right, activity ratio, because they have the low-hanging fruit of multitasking, which is often relatively easy to fix, and also the hidden factors. Those are ones where we can do often just simple automation of the existing way we do things to get that speed up and to reduce the multitasking. When we see the CNA things, the correct and accurate, that's where we often have to switch out the entire process because the way we built the day doesn't do a good job. We might look for a different way of doing it. So that's how we're going to pick them out. And then we're going to do an experiment. We're going to go through and inspect and adapt cycles, right? So that's how we can use value stream mapping in a very simple way to help us move and drive forward in our DevOps world. And with that, I'm now open to the Q&A portion of the day's conversation.
Earl, thanks very much. We have gotten a number of questions over the course of your presentation, so I'll go ahead and ask you the first one.
Okay.
This one is kind of a general question. It says, how small or large of a project should use DevOps? Is this only for enterprise software?
Well, that's a great question. It's like, how small is too small for DevOps? And the answer is actually, I don't think there is a too small for DevOps, because what happens when you get small enough, you just don't have ops, right? One of my long-standing jokes is that DevOps is the elimination of ops by dev. And ops is created by large organizations to maintain the production system. Well, when you're small, dev and ops are the same thing. You don't need to eliminate ops because you've never created ops. Your dev people are actually also your operation. They're managing and running the production systems. They're the first people that call if there's an issue in production. I remember back when I was working in telecommunication, we sort of had ops, but we were on call 24/7 by 365, right? Boom, right? And so there really wasn't much difference between us. They were just the monitors, not actually the owners so much. So as you get bigger, you start separating out those roles and concerns. Then DevOps as a methodology or a set of philosophies might be more helpful there. But when you're small, Dev and Ops, I think, are the same thing. So is value stream mapping helping the smallest of things? I think so. I think it could still be a slightly handy tool because it makes visible where you want to put your concentration together as a team. You might be able to pull it off in simple conversations at that point, but I think it's always good to make something visible we can point to saying we're going to attack here next.
Great, Earl. The next question is kind of a scenario-based question. It says, we typically divide stories into tasks. Different people take different tasks. They don't necessarily do their work at the same time, nor do their tasks take the same amount of time. How do we deal with the real world in which multiple people work on customer requests?
Okay, so let's break that down into two areas, because I think that's a great question, right? If we're in a world where we have a bunch of independent workers, right? That's what we're basically saying. We're not trying to act as a team, and we're not trying to be an agile team per se, where the team together solves problems. We have individuals solving problems. So we take a bit of things, we hand it out and break it apart. Some smart person breaks it apart, hands it to a bunch of individuals, and they're off on their own. And hopefully, if you have a daily stand-up, it's each individual saying, oh, here's what I worked on today. So we got two different ways to attack this. One is that you could decide to be a team again. You can say, you know what, we're going to stop this individual work and we're actually going to try to be a team and play it as a team sport. That would be our most agile way, in which case the value stream mapping is going to work really easily, because the whole team, you're measuring how long it takes the team to get something done, not any one individual. If we decide, no, we like being individual, we like handing task work to individuals and going forward, then we're going to say, we're going to look for those loops. We're going to ask each person, we're going to have to ask each person to start saying, where do you think their gaps are? Remember the mind the gaps thing? We're going to start focusing on the gaps first, because that's where we're going to look for wait states. Wait, because they have to wait for, especially on individual tasks like things, we have to wait for our turn to use the build system because we want to add our stuff. There's a wait state. We need to be able to get to testing resources. There's a wait state. You'll see a lot more of these wait states on the individual line than you will see on the team line typically, because with the team acting together, they're filling in those wait states by jumping off what they like to do onto something else. Whereas the next most important thing. Whereas on the individual, you'll see a lot more of those wait states. So you're going to ask those people to start saying, hey, we may not value stream map it, but let's use that concept. Show me where your hidden factories are, where you have to wait for other people to do things, and other wait states where you have to multitask and work on other things. And then we'll see if we can find experiments and go through our inspect and adapt cycle on those wait states and those hidden factories on the individual lines, and see if we can start consolidating that so they can go individually more quickly. If that's not what you're looking for, follow up with another Q&A while we ask another question.
All right, Earl, I'll move on to the next one for now. These are two kind of related questions. The questions are, how do you measure C&A, and how do you measure your accuracy in C&A?
Yeah, so how do you measure C&A, and how do you make sure that your C&A is not just people grumbling? So one of the things I suggested in the talk here, that my C&A is I'm looking for close enough numbers. And by close enough numbers, I actually mean here that you're looking at the person saying, about how much? And I've given you a set of choices. I've given you 10, 25, 50, 75, and 90 kind of thing, or 0. But you get to choose among those 4 choices which one you think is closest to. And that's how I did the measurement. Now, is this a true measure of the CNA, right, of the correct and accurate? No. No, it's obviously not. I'm asking you to roughly choose among these 5 choices which one is closest. And I remember the next step I'm going to do after that number's coming, I'm going to bring all the parties together to have a conversation. And what I found several times when I've had that conversation is that there's been a clear misunderstanding about what the handoff should really be. Right? They've gotten a low CNA number from the consumer because they thought they should be getting X, and the producers thought, no, we only produce Y. And we said, okay, you think you need X, you think you only produce Y, we've got to figure out a solution to this. And just figuring out a solution to that handoff solved a lot of throughput problems, right? So I didn't even need to have the number correct. Just the forcing of the conversation allowed me to fix the thing that needed to be fixed. And so that's what I'm looking for here. I'm not looking for a correct number because, again, if you start using these numbers to judge the quality in terms of, are you a good team? Are you a good step? Are you a good person? People are going to game these numbers anyhow, and they're not going to be very useful to you. But if you start using them as a way to start saying, where should I focus my conversation? That's a whole different story. And if one team is reporting, I'm getting low CNA, and say, okay, let's bring together with your producers and have a conversation, and there's disagreement, we got something to fix. If there's agreement, we can say, okay, you said 10 on the CNA, which is really, really bad. We went to the producer to see, oh yeah, this is really hard. We don't see how we ever get this right. Here's an area that we really need to pay some attention to and figure out better practices this year, because this is obviously a critical step because we can't have the CNA loop. So in short, my answer is I'm not trying to get correct CNA. If you really wanted to do it, you'd have to create checklists and have more formal things like inspections. So if you really wanted to get a good CNA number, you would have to put an inspection station after every step. And that inspection station, when you do an inspection, is you say, okay, we're going to submit whatever you just produced out of that step to a checklist. And a bunch of impartial reviewers who are going to look at that thing, judge it against the checklist, and then give you an overall score. That's the way if you want a truly true number, but that's a high burden to put on a team. It's a lot of extra work. And then as far as improving to go to DevOps, I'm not thinking it adds you a ton of value.
All right, Earl, and here's a question that might also be somewhat related, and you may have already covered parts of it, but I'm going to ask it anyway. It's what are some good ways to measure lead time and processing time?
So some good ways to measure lead time and processing time. Yeah, this is one place where a lot of people get hung up because they're looking for, do I have to have people entering tools in every day? Do I have to, every time they touch something, hit a stopwatch? Kind of like speed chess. Jesse, did you ever play speed chess or time chess as a kid?
I did not, Earl.
Yeah, okay. So for those who haven't, like you, that haven't played, basically there's a timer next to you, and every time you do a move, you hit the timer, which starts the other guy's timer or their gal's timer. And then when they finally finish their move, they hit the timer and start your timer. And if you don't finish a certain amount of time, you lose, right? So if the faster they go, the more time they can save for future moves. And so that's a very rigorous amount of time. You have to touch this timer every time. I don't do that. Again, because I'm not looking to say this is your job. I'm trying to judge the quality of your job. I'm trying to judge exactly how much time in your job. I'm looking for good enough numbers. And so how do I measure that? So what is going to happen is that, first of all, I'm going to map my value stream. Because first of all, I'm going to figure out what the heck do I need to measure. And so I'm going to identify those steps. And then I'm going to say to the team, here's these steps. What is your indicator typically that something's come into this step? And what's your indicator that something's leaving the step? So we have to find out what are the events or the visual signs or the cue that something has come into this step and something's leaving this step, right? And then once we identify those indicator cues, I'm going to start saying as part of maybe my daily stand-up, or maybe I'll go around and do a walk around, management by walking around. I'm going to say maybe once every couple days, I'm going to say how many things have come into your queue and how many things have left, and about how much time did they spend in this queue. So that's going to be my lead time. And then once I get the lead time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a couple of those things and say, okay, tell me when the next thing comes in your queue. And then we'll take that one thing on. Then once we get that one thing, I'll start saying, for this one thing, I want you to do the speed chess kind of thing. I want you to start to track about how much time you spent on it when you had to go work on something else. You came back, and I'll check with you once a day or every other day. And we'll ask you to just sort of remember about how much would happen. Because within a day or 2 days, you still have a fresh enough memory that you can just say, yeah, I worked on it for a couple hours yesterday morning. Then I went to lunch. Then I came back and I worked on this other thing. And then I started working again at about 2 o'clock. And I spent another hour on it. But then I had a meeting at 4 or at 3 o'clock. So I only spent an hour on it. And then went to the meeting and I picked it up again this morning and I finished it off in a 2-hour sprint. Right? Or 2-hour bits of work. That's the kind of thing you're looking for. That memory within a day or two of it actually happening. Now you can tack this on to the end of your daily stand-up for the sampling that you're going to do. Because that's the third thing I'm doing. I'm only going to sample this work. I'm going to say, notify me the next one that meets your input criteria, and then we're going to watch that one through. And then I'll let a couple more go through. Okay, this one, let's watch it go through. And I'm going to sample 4 or 5 of these things to get a sense. If they're all roughly happening the same kind of way, I'm figuring I'm good enough. If it's radically different, I'll do another 5 of those and see if I can get a mode that's the most common number. But I'm going to sample, and I'm going to say, use your indicators to say when or when. And I'm going to say every day or every couple of days, I'm just going to say, remember that thing we sampled? Okay, that's what we're tracking. Tell me what happened, right? But I don't want them trying to log themselves on log. If you really want to get really great at this, you create paper logs. People log every time they touch it. They log when they put it away. You can get really detailed like that. But again, I don't think that's going to deliver the value you're really looking for to try to pick on what's the next thing you want to attack in a DevOps transformation.
Thanks, Earl. Here's the next question. Earl, you talked about capacity allocation for the DevOps backlog. Do you keep it consistent or do you vary it over time? And if it varies over time, how often and when in the cycle do you adjust the capacity?
Right, my capacity. So I think that's a really important question for teams that are trying to budget their time and decide what's going on. To me, it comes down to a matter of prioritization. I try to keep the capacity relatively constant. My goal as an agile development team in particular, and even including some of the operations side, is to deliver consistency to the product owner. I want to be consistent as possible to the product owner so the product owner can make reasonable predictions to all the stakeholders that they represent and be able to make decent plans. If I keep changing my allocation of other things, that means my velocity is going to have to change to match that, and which means my product owner doesn't have a very consistent world. So I want to keep it consistent. That said, I'm going to have critical discussions up front that says, how important is this DevOps transformation to us? Now, I think I do never want to go over about 25% capacity because I always want to be doing something to deliver something to the customer on a regular basis, and I want that to be a big chunk of my work. So I usually top it off at about 25%. I can lower it down to 10% without a lot of heartburn, but it's going to take a lot longer. That is going to be a slow transformation. I like slow transformations because I tend to think those stick a lot better than let's rip everything off and change everything tomorrow kind of transformations. But so I like it. I like the slow, steady ones, always making progress, the next most important thing. So I like to keep it constant. If you do vary it, don't do it more than once a quarter, I would suggest, so that the product owner can have enough time to adjust, understand the new velocity, and make better predictions.
All right, we have time for maybe a couple more questions. Here's the next one, Earl. Does the value map need to include everything we do when we create and release software?
Yeah, so the value map does not need to contain everything. Because one thing the value map really needs to do for you is to help you decide where to go next in this particular method. I mean, if you're doing true value stream mapping for overall totally understanding of your process, yeah, sure. But for what we need to do in a DevOps transformation, we just want to know where to put our nose in and really to focus the next time. So I only say capture those main things that tend to happen every time, the one-offs, the occasional stuff. Just leave that out. You're not going to solve that with your first bits of DevOps transformation. Once we get a lot of things automated, then we can start looking at those secondary things, and we'll worry about that when that time comes.
Awesome, Earl. Let's wrap it up with this final question. What kind of dog do you have?
You all heard my dog. Oh my gosh. You know, this is the great fear of every presenter now working from home. It's like, will the dog go off during the thing? I have a foster dog of all things. This is a funny story. A gentleman, friend of ours, elderly gentleman, fell down, was not able to tend to his dog. And we said, we'll take him for a few days while you recover. That was a little over a year ago. So we have this foster dog for a year now. It is what's known as a throwback Pomeranian. Pomeranians were usually a sort of 15, 20-pound dog, but Queen Victoria wanted a lap dog, so she started breeding them to be smaller. to be down to the 7-pound size overall. But the genetic material for the 15-pounder is still there. And this is a 15-pound Pomeranian. It's a throwback gene. And not all of his genes got the same message. Some messages got the 7-pound Pomeranian. Some parts got the 15-pound Pomeranian. So he's one little messed up dog.
Thanks, Earl. That was a fun one to end on. And thank you for the presentation and the Q&A session. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in and staying with us here until the end. We'll stay tuned again this week for another webinar that we'll announce coming up in a couple of weeks. If you have any other questions or questions that weren't answered or would like to learn more about how these concepts apply to your organization and how we at Constructs can help and how Earl can, feel free to reach out to me personally at any time, and we're happy to take a look there. We really look forward to seeing you the next time, and thank you, Earl, again for the great presentation.